Aiming for the heart, Harry thrusted. The sharpened stick drew a deep scratch in the wild pig's skin as it basically bounced off the thick hide. The boar squealed angrily and yanked ferociously at the trap. Something had to give, and the young sapling was the thing to give, with the cord still tied to its foot, but now free. The boar charged Harry, who let out a very undignified yelp and dropped his spear in surprise. He jumped aside, grabbing the boar as it raced past, and tried to hold on to it. The pig thrashed, rolling over the ground to throw Harry off, then charged again, trying desperately to stay away from that mouth with sharp-looking tusks. Harry grabbed hold of the beast's neck, and tried to keep his body parts away from the front of the beast. He was fighting for his life. "Now, remember thy knife, boy," he heard a female voice shout. Harry grunted, reached with one hand to his knife, unfixed the clasp, grabbed the weapon, and thrust it savagely into the boar's neck. It squealed once, then fell. Harry stayed on his back, panting, staring at the skies. His body hurt. "Thou made thy first kill, and in a personal manner," Zoe noted, staring down at him. Harry just nodded, looking at his hands, now covered in the pig's blood. He swallowed deeply. "Using a ranged weapon would have been easier," she noted, still looking down at him. He drew in a deep breath. His heart had finally stopped pounding so hard. "I couldn't make a bow and become any good with it in such a short time," he protested. Zoe looked amused. "Thou could have brought thy bow," she replied. Harry frowned, looking up at her. "I don't have a bow. Artie conjures one for me to learn with, then vanishes it when the lesson's over." Zoe grin vanished. "Oh," she said, looking shocked. She obviously hadn't expected that. "I suppose you have your bow?" Harry asked, just a little bit of snark entering his voice. He'd just fought for his life. Some rest would be good. Zoe didn't take it personally, and pulled her bow from underneath her cloak. "One of my lady's gifts is to be able to draw our bows when required, and stow them away when not required," she said. Harry didn't reply, and just groaned. "Sometimes, it didn't pay to be a boy." "Dost thou remember how to butcher a kill?" Zoe asked when 5 minutes had passed and he made no effort to move. Harry groaned, and sat up. He was covered on bruises and cuts from where the pig had dragged him over the ground. He nodded, and stared at the boar. "I should butcher it here, so the smell doesn't attract bears," he said. Zoe did not reply now that he was getting up, and stepped back into the background. The boy stood up completely, and grabbed the cord that was still tied to the hog's hind leg. He dragged it over to a sturdy-looking tree, and hoisted it up. He stared at it. Finally, he steeled himself, and yanked the knife out of the pig's throat, and started dressing his kill. First, he opened the hide, and stripped it off the carcass. Before opening the belly cavity, making sure not to rupture the bowel, which would contaminate the meat. Then he started cutting the carcass up into manageable chunks. The haunches, the ribs, and so forth. He ended up with kilos and kilos of valuable meat. He had to cook them and cure them quickly, before the smell would attract bears. He also had to do it quickly, before the meats boiled. Thankfully, the weather was cool and so it wouldn't spoil almost immediately. He stepped away, carrying his precious meat. "Wait," Zoe said, stopping him. She approached the carcass, and with practiced ease, removed its tusks. "Take these as thy spoil. Thou hast defeated thy enemy." Harry accepted the tusks. "I don't understand," he finally said, looking up at his teacher. "When thou defeat a monster, thou receive a spoil of war. That this is a mortal creature makes no difference. Thou should receive a spoil for it," she explained. Harry just nodded, and pocketed the tusks. "Thanks, Miss Zoe." She remained silent, but he saw her dip her head in response. He carried the meat away from the butcher site, now poised to attract bears, and found a different spot, still far enough away from camp that a bear wouldn't go and wander through it. With the blunt back of the useless spear, he dug a pit. Before lining the bottom with stones, he built a fire on top of said stones, letting them heat up considerably. After the fire burnt itself out, he put the boar meat on top of the stones, covered it with green leaves from nearby plants, then covered the whole thing with dirt. It would take about 4 hours to cook through. While the meat cooked in his underground oven, Harry returned to camp, and built a wooden frame that he used to stretch out the boar hide to prevent it from shrinking as it dried. In a couple of days, he would be able to clean that, and make use of it. By the time he was done with his frame, and stretching out the hide, his oven had almost done cooking, so he returned to it. Opening it up, the smell made his mouth water. The first piece of meat he dug up was a leg, and he eagerly bit into it. The smile that appeared on his lips matched the contented noise that came out of his mouth as he chewed nice, hot, cooked bull leg. Filling his stomach, he dug up the rest of the meat and carried it all back to camp. That night, he slept like a brick, fully sated, warm and dry and comfortable, as good as he felt when he went to bed that night. So bad did he feel when he got up the next morning. First, he was stiff and sore from his fight with the boar. His bruises had come through completely, and no matter where or how he moved, at least one of them was impacted. Secondly, Zeus had turned his anger loose on the world again, and thunderstorms plagued the mountains. Thankfully, the roof Harry had made for his fire was proving useful, and the fire kept burning all day. The rains drenched the environment, and Harry was forced to leave his warm and dry tent to collect more firewood. With the torrential rains, all the wood he found was wet, and wet wood simply didn't generate a lot of heat when burnt, not even with his Hestia-taught skills. Thankfully, he had enough meat so he didn't have to go and forage. He could simply hole up and stare at the fire, and eat, and sometimes go and collect more firewood. He tried reading the school books he had brought, but the storm plunged the forest into semi-darkness. Harry didn't mind, he had plenty of food, and for once, didn't have to worry. He could spend his time gazing into the fire, or stare at the half-shaded forest through the curtain of rain. He was at peace. He slept well that night, despite not having done anything other than collect firewood and stuff himself full of boar. The next morning, the weather had changed again, and the sun was shining. Harry smiled at it. Maybe he would have to make an offering to Mr. Apollo at some point. It was his last full day in the forest. 7 days. Tomorrow, his test would be over, and Zoe was going to take him back. He hoped that he had done well. He'd definitely survived, and even had it good, but he was also aware that he had made some major mistakes. He started scraping the boar hide to remove any fat and tissues from it. As he worked, he thought about his performance. He'd prioritized the fire too much the first day or two, and it had left him extremely hungry, too hungry, as he had eaten those dock roots, which had turned out to be problematic. He was lucky it had been a severe bout of diarrhea, and not something worse. When he finished scraping the hide, and cut some holes in it and turned it into a makeshift vest, the boar's fur had a bristly top layer, and a very soft undercoat. It was also very warm. Harry grinned. He could have used his boarskin vest the first couple of days, when he had been cold and shivering in his tent. He decided that he was going to make a feast of it tonight, to celebrate having it good and to celebrate his final evening in the woods. He went out and looked for edibles. He found a couple of handfuls of wood sorrel-like lettuce. It contained flavor but few nutrients. He also collected more blueberries. He also found a dandelion or two. Using his knife, he peeled some bark from a birch, and wrapped it tightly around a couple handfuls of freshly picked pine needles. That would make for a great candle. By the time the evening fell, Harry had pulled a tree stump next to the fire for him to sit up, and had constructed a rudimentary table out of a second tree stump. He lit his improvised candle at the campfire, and stuck it in the middle of his table. On top of said improvised table was a salad of wood sorrel and dandelion leaves, a hunk of boar meat, blueberries and blueberry sauce, and a canteen full of pine needle tea. He sat down, and was about to tuck in, when he looked at where Zoe had camped. He hadn't seen her eat or drink, so he assumed she was doing so out of his view so as to not tempt him. She was probably making do with some sort of rations, though. "Miss Zoe?" he asked. "Harry," she answered. "Would you like to join me?" he asked, pointing to the other side of his table. I have plenty of boar meat left, and it would be a shame to let it go to waste. Her first reaction was obviously to decline. He could see it. Preparing himself to eat alone, he could see her reconsider, before shrugging. Why not? She finally said, dragging her own tree stump over. Harry grinned, and hurriedly put a second filet-o-boar near the fire to heat it up. A candle, Harry? She commented as they waited for the meat to heat up. Harry shrugged. It's my last day here. I thought I'd try something different. I'm just glad it worked. Zoe laughed softly. Tea would be a different atmosphere to eat in total darkness, I admit, she said. They sat in companionable silence. The meat's almost ready, Harry said, judging the time with an expert sigh. Let's start with our appetizer, he added, motioning for the salad made from wood sorrel, dandelions, and other assorted greens. Zoe just nodded in amusement, and they divided the salad between them. Having planned for one, the salad was a bit small for the both of them, but neither said anything, as there was plenty of meat to come. Having judged correctly, Harry served the boar meat. There's blueberry sauce to go with it, Harry said, motioning for the cup holding the substance in question. Again, they divided between them. Zoe definitely seemed to like his rustic cooking, as the blueberry sauce-slathered boar meat vanished quickly. Harry grinned. He loved it when people appreciated his food. He ate with gusto as well, and soon they had both finished. Holding out a cup of blueberries, Harry asked, "Blueberry dessert?" Zoe laughed, and picked a couple of blueberries out of the cup, leaving the rest for him. They sat in silence again, listening to the sounds of the forest and the snapping of the wood in the fire. As Harry sat, leaning back, looking up at the wide-open skies, he was hit with an overwhelming feeling of gratitude. Gratitude for the food he had gathered, gratitude for the forest, for the fire, for being able to experience this sensation. He wondered if the gods could hear him. He decided that it didn't matter. He closed his eyes. Thanks everyone, even Mr. Zeus, he supposed. His thunderstorms had added challenge, but in the end, without the rains, nothing would grow. Dragging himself out of his introspective mood, he found himself staring at the fire, with Zoe sitting on the other side, staring into the fire from the opposite side. "Miss Zoe?" he asked. Zoe visibly dragged herself out of her own thoughts. "Harry?" she answered. He smiled slightly. "Hestia said you were one of Atti's first hunters. Is that true?" Zoe nodded. "Indeed, I have been with my lady the longest out of all the hunters." The young boy looked amazed. "You must have seen a lot of history," he said. The hunter looked amused. "Is that thy way of asking my age? Thou should know never to ask a lady her age." Harry sputtered. That hadn't been his intention at all. "No, that wasn't what I asked at all," he protested. "I just wanted to know if you were part of any large events in history." His teacher smiled faintly. "Not often," she replied. "My lady doeth her best to keep us from harmful events." She thought for a few moments. "There is one tale that may interest thee," she added. "'T is how I learned to drive an automobile. During the Second World War, us hunters were tasked with evacuating innocent maidens from London during the Blitz. As such, I learned to drive an automobile while evading exploding bombs." Harry blinked. "Whoa," he admitted, as Zoe grinned, and elaborated on her tale. Being the first of Artemis hunters, having been with her through thick and thin for nigh on 2,000 years, had given Zoe an exceptional skill in teaching. She was used to teaching hunters, but Harry appeared to be no different, and as such enthralled him with her tale soon enough. The next morning, he disassembled his camp, and followed Zoe back to the hunter's camp using that unique speed-walking skill. Within minutes, they were back. "Welcome back, old friend," Artie greeted Zoe after they had finished stowing the pack Harry had borrowed, and moving everything back to the small backpack he had originally arrived with. The goddess glanced down at Harry, and added, "Harry, you seem well." He grinned, and gave the goddess of the hunt a hug. "Hi Artie," he said, "I am well, too." Artie looked amused. "You look like you wrestled a bear." "It was a boar," Harry replied, grinning. "It was delicious, especially with blueberry sauce. Artie blinked, and shot her hunter a look. Zoe simply nodded. The goddess looked down at Harry again. "Well, then, it seems congratulations are in order." "Thanks, Artie," Harry chirped. The goddess just dipped her head once, then looked at Zoe. "How is his evaluation?" "He hath passed," she stated calmly, then turned to Harry. "Thou hath done well. The first rule of survival is always to survive. Thou survived, and did so well, so thou hath passed, even if it was close at times." Harry grinned widely. "Thanks, Miss Zoe." The hunter didn't acknowledge his gratitude, and instead pressed on. "There were areas of improvement, however. Thou prioritized fire the first few days, leaving thee without food. Thou drank from a stream without boiling the water, understandable as thou hath no drunk in close to a day. However, it was a risk. Thou may need to get examined for parasites." Harry nodded, but kept quiet. "Thou hath also eaten multiple curly dock roots. While they are edible, and possess medicinal qualities, they should not be eaten in the quantities thou did, and it caused thee severe intestinal issues. No doubt the untreated water did not aid thee either." The boy just nodded, looking at his feet. He had messed up, and he knew it. "However, I was impressed with thy fortitude. Thou pushed on, and did not falter in thy test. It would have been easy for thee to abandon the test and return to seek aid. Thou did not." It was impressive. Harry looked up, shyly, and offered a small smile. Zoe acted as if she did not notice, and said further, "Thou started looking for food in earnest, tracked a prey, set a trap, and spent the time needed for the trap to work with gathering more food. Thou improved drastically when thou had a full belly. Thou ended with plenty of food, allowing thee the time to wait out the storm, and to end the final day with a minor feast. Thou did well. Remember thy priorities so thee do not end in starvation mode, as that affects thy ability to reason, and thou should survive with nary a difficulty." Harry smiled. "Thanks, Miss Zoe." The hunter finally acknowledged his gratitude, then turned to Artie. "During the survival, Harry hath trapped a boar. It managed to escape the trap during his attempt to kill it. Afterwards, I questioned his decision not to bring about a my surprise. He admitted that he did not possess one." Artie nodded. "I am willing to teach him how to properly use a bow. However, I draw the line at actually providing him with one. He is male, and therefore, not a hunter." "I see," Zoe replied. "If that is thy will, my lady." "You don't agree?" Artie asked, actually sounding surprised. The hunter thought about her answer, and ended up saying, "I assumed, as thou art teaching Harry bow skills, that thou wouldst be supplying him with a bow with which to do so, even if it were a conventional one. Would have greatly aided his test." Artie just shrugged. "I won't stop him from getting a bow, I just won't be handing him one. If he wants one, he can go and get one. Same with a quiver and arrows. If he is willing to carry a mortal bow, a mortal quiver, and mortal arrows, I will not stop him." Zoe dipped her head. "Of course, my lady." Harry, meanwhile, nodded eagerly. He didn't know where he could get a bow, a quiver, or arrows from. But if he could get them, Artie wasn't going to stop him. Then again, a bow, a quiver, and arrows were heavy and bulky, and they would hinder him from carrying the hunter's pack he had borrowed. He'd have to think things through. Zoe turned to Harry as he was thinking, and had the tiny smile on her lips that showed she knew exactly what he was thinking. "I do believe it is time for thee to return. Lady Hestia no doubt will wish to see thee, and congratulate thee on a successful test on basic survival." Harry grinned at the thought of seeing Hestia, and made to turn. "Oh, I almost forgot," he said, reaching down to remove the hunting knife and its sheath from his belt. "I still have this." Zoe held up her hand. "Thou can keep it. Thou hath shown that thou can use it properly, and it hath saved thy life, so I see no reason not to give it to thee." Harry's smile widened. "Thanks, Miss Zoe," he shouted. He made half a step, reconsidered, and opened his arms wide. "Celebratory hug?" he offered hopefully. The hunter looked amused, and extended her fight hand. "Celebratory handshake," she offered in return. Harry grinned. and shook her hand. "Thanks, Miss Zoe," he repeated, before turning and giving Artie a big hug. "Thanks, Artie." He turned to the campfire and waved over his shoulder. "See you soon." The fire turned green, and Harry vanished through it before either could respond. He arrived at Helios' temple, and started to make his way to the front, where he could probably greet the statue of Helios. "Hi Hestia, I'm in here," he said loudly, while confronting Helios' statue. "Hi Mr. Helios, I'm back," and I passed. Helios' presence enveloped him for a moment, as if in congratulations, then eased off when Hestia arrived. He made it halfway there before the hearth whooshed behind him. "Hi Hestia," Harry greeted again, giving his all-time favorite goddess a big hug. He'd missed her a lot. She hugged him back. "Hello Harry," she said, on her usual gentle tone. Harry luxuriated in the sensation of warmth, comfort, and protection that came with a real Hestia hug. She pulled back. "Now, how did your test go, and why do you look like you've been in a fight?" the goddess of the hearth asked, smiling slightly. Harry grinned, and started explaining as he unpacked his backpack, and started putting things away, either in his bathroom, or in the laundry hamper. He finished his tale with, "And Miss Zoe said I passed, even if I messed up my priorities at the start." Hestia was nodding thoughtfully. "I see," she said, after a moment of pause. It surprised Harry, as she was usually more involved with his progress. The kind goddess touched his shoulder, and the aches and pains of his cuts and bruises vanished. He remembered her saying she could heal minor wounds. "Congratulations on passing your test, Harry," she finally said, smiling softly. "Thanks, Hestia," Harry said, feeling proud of his accomplishments. He felt a bit bad about not being able to study for school, but he really had been very busy with just surviving. It was a lot more work than he thought it would be, and his respect for the old hunter-gatherers had climbed sharply. "We should visit Apollo and make sure you're fit and healthy," Hestia then said, dragging his thoughts back to the present, "and then I will take you to camp, to see if you are interested in some other hobbies instead of playing in the woods with Artie and her hunters." Harry blinked. "Huh?" Hestia patted his shoulder, and gave him that patented gentle smile of hers. "While I don't mind you playing in the woods with Artie and her hunters, I do get upset when it leaves you injured, and potentially infected with things." Harry frowned. "But it's not playing, it's hard work, and it just may keep me alive when things fall apart, and I'm on my own." Hestia had somehow gotten him to the large front doors of the temple without him realizing it, his feet just following her where her gentle yet insistent direction indicated he should go. "While a useful skill, I'm not enthused about you being exposed to parasites or pathogens. Let's see if Apollo can clear those up." "But Hestia," Harry whined in protest, in a way he'd never would have dared with his aunt and uncle. Hestia smiled faintly at hearing it. It looked like he was starting to learn to stand up for himself. Good. She wouldn't really stop him from spending time with Artemis and her hunters, but that didn't mean it wasn't time for her to introduce him to camp and broaden his horizons. "We shall see," she replied neutrally, inwardly pleased about the fact that he was acting like an average 8-year-old. "Finally, first, we shall visit Apollo and make sure you're healthy." "Yes, Hestia," Harry pouted,